Well, the royal council surrounding Elizabeth I had been in a state of agitation for several years over the succession. None of Henry VIII's three children had children of their own, so there were no issue when Elizabeth was near the end of her life. And the royal council was trying to get her to agree to the succession. Well, what was it that she was objecting to? It was that brat of Mary Stuart. Well, you see, the royal council wanted a Tudor monarch to succeed Elizabeth. Where were they going to find one? Well, they jumped back a generation to the generation of Henry VIII. Now, he had a brother and two sisters. His brother died before him, so he was out of the picture. Henry succeeded, and we know what happened to him. His sister Mary disappeared across the continent, but the oldest sister, and the oldest of the four, Margaret, was married by their father to King James IV of Scotland. Well, they produced a son who became James V of Scotland. James V married Mary of Guise, a French princess, and they produced their daughter Mary. She subsequently married the French king, was widowed, returned to Scotland as reigning monarch. You know her as Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. She married her distant cousin Henry Darnley, Henry Stuart, known as Lord Darnley. And they produced a son who was now, at the time of our story, in 1600 and some, the reigning king in Scotland, James VI. And it was on him that Elizabeth's council had settled. And it was him she couldn't abide, that damned Mary Stuart. What a pain in the ass she had been to Elizabeth for 30 years. But finally Elizabeth acceded, signed the succession documents, and it was James who would succeed her. When Elizabeth died in 1603, James was preparing to descend on England. And he arrived shortly after the obsequies had finished. And he had a very thick Scots burr, and brought with him, of course, to London his own Scottish peers and courtiers to comfort him. And they all enjoyed his jokes, which he would tell in his thick Scots burr, and nobody in England could understand a word he was saying. Well, shortly after his arrival, the next year after the coronation, he called the famous Hampton Court Conference, held in Hampton Court Palace, which is just up the Thames River, and he was going to settle the issue of doctrine and the whole thing for the subjects. Conference produced the authorized version of the Bible. You would know it as the King James Version. It was published first in 1611. Well, the Catholics were furious. The king had been very conciliatory toward them, and they felt that they had been betrayed. Rome had been sending over the Marines of Christ, as we called ourselves, the Jesuits. They were there to bring down this Protestant government. And they were organizing terrorists among the radical Catholics to do just this. They were funded from Rome. Well, shortly after the conference ended and the publication that I mentioned came out, it was time for Parliament to meet. The Parliament House wasn't anything like it is today, but it was an established structure where both houses met. And it was time for King James to open Parliament of 1605, I guess it was. And the building, to be useful, they had let out parts of it to the public. You rent and they had rented the basement to, they didn't know, was this Catholic insurgency movement. Well, during the weeks preceding the meeting of Parliament, the insurgents, the Jesuits were organizing this, were bringing in at night kegs of dynamite, or gunpowder we called it then. Kegs of gunpowder. They filled the basement with kegs of gunpowder. And on the day the king arrived in Parliament with both houses in attendance, they were going to set it off and blow him to hell, along with everybody else. However, somebody, just before the meeting, apparently told the authorities to look in the basement, which they did. Oh my God, oh my God. And there was a gentleman in the corner piling up kegs of gunpowder. He was quite surprised, of course, and some of his Confederates were also there. They all made a dash for the door, but the authorities caught the one, and his name was Guy Fawkes. He was a non-entity. He was just a hod carrier in this whole project. But they ran down, I think, 5 or 6 others, tortured them all until they confessed, and then hanged them. This took place on November the 5th, 1605, and we have celebrated that day ever since with the burning in effigy of Guy Fawkes. So I expect you all out in attendance on November the 5th.